Anyway, as I was saying, good morning, church. Well, now what happened to my remote? It was in, here we go. So anyway, it's been a while since I've done this, can you tell? I have no idea what I'm doing. Anyway, before I get into the message, I want to let you guys know about a quick announcement. On August 24th, the plan is to do some baptisms. Now, I realized that just a couple months ago we did, was it 9 or 11? 19. Oh, it was both of those, minus a couple.
It started at 12 and ended at 19.
Anyway,
Right.
yeah, 19. We did 19 baptisms, so we might be a little dry at the moment. But the plan is on August 24th to have baptisms. And so if you are interested in being baptized, you can just let us know by filling out your Connect card in front of you. There's a little box you check that says baptism. Or you can sign up on Church Center, which Jacob mentioned this morning. Or you can always just come talk to us too if that makes it easier for you, because we'd really love to get you dunked if that's what you want to do, because it really is a powerful thing that we do as believers. And we'll have a conversation about what that means and all that, but if you're interested in being baptized, just let us know through one of those ways. All right, this morning I'm going to be doing something a little bit unusual. As you know, I just got back from a 5-week sabbatical, or you probably know. And this morning, what I'm going to be doing that is unusual is I'm going to be summarizing for you some of the lessons that I learned over that 5 weeks. It's something that you as a church have invested into me, so I figure I should share with you. But it is a little bit unusual. Now, what happened is my wife, Tasha, and my daughter, Gracie, and we took our vintage camper on a long trip. It was 5,500 miles, almost exactly to the dot. I took that picture on my dash as I was pulling into the driveway. Well, maybe I was already in the driveway because the door's open, so I must have already been in the driveway. Or Tosh was really in a hurry to get out of the truck. One of the two. But you can see as I pulled into my driveway, it was 5,500.7. And I was like, dang it, I knew I shouldn't have made that last stop at Tim Hortons. But now basically, this might seem a little bit like a vacation slideshow, like, here's me and Marge at the Statue of Liberty or whatever, but that's not exactly what I'm trying to do here. You see, before I mentioned that before I left on sabbatical, I let you guys know that this would be an extended spiritual rest that pastors get as a benefit, right? Like at your job, you might get stock options or a gym membership or something like that. Well, I get 5 weeks to reconnect to God in solitude every 5 years or so. And so today, unlike our normal messages where I just go straight into Scripture and pull out what the Scripture says based on what the Scripture, how it's organized, I'm going to be sharing with you what God showed me on that trip. All recorded in this journal right here. Some of you might recognize this. Right before I left, Uriah presented this to me up here. It was a journal that I filled in, and I'm kind of dumb because Uriah wrote me this really nice note at the front, and I filled it in the other way. It's hard to tell what's the cover on this thing, all right? So, but apparently, however I started this trip is how my mind is still working. So I kept track of everything that happened on the trip, not just, what was done, but also the spiritual lessons God was teaching me along the way. And so my hope is that what God showed me would also encourage you in your walk with Jesus as well, because the idea behind this is rest, and I'm sure you're probably tired of hearing about rest because it's all we've been talking about for months, right? But it is something that is important, and I want to show you the other side of that, okay? So basically, I want to fill you guys in. For our journey, we made a giant loop in our camper, and I have a map for you so you could see our pathway, because why not? We went up through Iowa and Minnesota and North Dakota, where we stopped at Jamestown, and then we headed west, where we stopped at Great Falls, Montana. Then we went over to number 4 there, where we hit Glacier National Park on the west side. Then we went up into the land of maple syrup and stuff, and hockey. And we went to Banff National Park, and then we went up to number 6, which is Jasper National Park, and then we scooted over to number 7, which is Edmonton, and then we went through Saskatchewan, there's nothing there, and then we came back down the plan was to stop there in North Dakota, and then we came home. So that was the trip that we did, okay? So it took a little while, and we took our camper, and our camper's name is Miss Betty. We named it after my dog. And we made lots of stops along the way, and it seemed like every time we made one of these stops, God had a different lesson that he wanted to teach me. And so here's the first place that we stopped. This is like kind of a culmination of Jamestown and Great Falls. After we stopped at a truck stop, which if you ever want to get a good night's rest, do it in a truck stop. And then we went to Jamestown for the weekend, and then we bumped on over to Great Falls after another truck stop. Now, during this first chunk, God started to teach me my first very important lesson, okay? So I have a picture of Miss Betty in case you're curious. That's what my trailer looks like going down the road. She was made in 1967, and I rebuilt her from the studs up. So traveling 5,500 miles in a 60-year-old thing that I built took something called faith. Now, in the end, she made it the whole way, and all I lost was a couple of hubcaps and a window shutter, which could be worse. I also had to make daily repairs to the air conditioner, which was very annoying because every time I had to climb up on the roof to fix it, I always had an audience and the people next to me, which was fun. Now, but it's interesting because as I got this lesson in faith, it wasn't actually the trailer that taught me the lesson in faith. See, I started trying to follow that structure that I mentioned to you before I left that had the spiritual routines of reading these books and certain prayers and study plans and learning how to delegate goals and things like that. And as I was trying to do those things, it didn't work. It wasn't working. And that's when one of the elders' voices came back to me. I can't remember which elder it was, but I'll just leave you in mystery because I'm in mystery. One of them said, make sure you leave room for the Spirit to do what he wants to do on the trip too. And as it turns out, the Spirit didn't want room. He wanted the whole plan. And so the first lesson I had to learn was this. Lesson number 1, if you're filling in your blanks, you can fill this in too, because these also apply to you. Sometimes you have to get away from the noise. That first week, I couldn't really disconnect. My mind was still on church, deacons and prayer lists and planning sermons and worrying about who was doing what, but I had to let that go. That's why today's message is called North of the Noise. I was trying to get away from the noise where there was no internet, no cell service, right? To get away and to be alone. Now, the noise I needed to get away from isn't a bad thing. The noise of being around here isn't bad, right? But it's like a rock concert. Rock concerts have their time and place, but when you need to take a nap, you don't go to a rock concert, right? You get into silence, solitude. And so God wanted to separate me from what I was doing so that I could just spend time with him. Now, this is something that Jesus does over and over and over again in the scripture, right? Now, most of us would agree that Jesus' ministry really starts after his baptism, right? He gets baptized, and then he hops on a tour bus and immediately starts preaching across the nation in large stadiums, right? We all know the story. I mean, I said that wrong. He formed an LLC and then a 501c3, and then he put his budget together, came up with a cool logo, right? You know, the things that ministers do. Right? Well, no, actually, that's not what Jesus did at all. If we flip over to the book of Matthew, chapter 4, right at the beginning of the chapter, we'll actually see the way that Jesus started his ministry, and it's a really interesting way to do it. All right? Then Jesus was led up by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil. And after fasting 40 days and 40 nights, he was hungry. Oh, that's odd. You know, the word for wilderness there is eremos in the Greek. And it can mean desert or wilderness, but really what it means is like an isolated, unpopulated place of loneliness, okay? You might say Jesus went off into the middle of nowhere so he could be alone. And it's like, wait, so Jesus starts his ministry by getting away from people. That should tell us something, church. And that's why I think that this is really important. Now, a lot of people think like, okay, Jesus went off to fight the devil, right? Like I'm going to go find the devil so I can fight him. I don't think so. I think that the devil showed up there to fight Jesus, right? Jesus wasn't there just to find him. He went there to be alone with the Father and the Spirit, and Satan was trying to mess that up, and so he had to fight back, okay? This wasn't just a show of his strength. He went to be alone with God because that's where he would get his strength from. This was good for Jesus, not just a battle. Okay? Now, the temptation, of course, is a part of it, right? The text tells us that he went there to be tempted by the devil. But the reality is that he was in the isolated point where he could fast and be alone with God because that's where he would draw his strength. The lesson here isn't if you want to be tough, go face temptation in the desert. The lesson is if you want to do ministry, make sure you're in step with God before you ever start going after people. It's sad because we've trained ourselves to avoid this kind of stillness. Just next time you get a chance, pay attention. Go sit in a waiting room and don't pick up your phone. You just sit there like, what do I do? Do I talk to the person next to me? Oh, they're on their phone, right? You can't. Like, we just don't know how to be alone. We don't know how to be isolated. We don't know how to be away from the noise. But if we can't learn to be still, we can't learn to hear God. And I found this again during those long hours of driving with Tosh asleep and Gracie on her phone, just me and God in the wilderness called the driver's seat. You know, Jesus isolated with God so much. Before he chose his 12 disciples, he went off into desolation. When his cousin John the Baptist died, he had alone to be with God the Father. So many times we see that the crowds or the disciples can't find Jesus, and when they find him, it's like, hey, we need you. Everybody's looking for you. And Jesus is like, no. I need to be with my Father in heaven more than I need to just go out and meet everyone else's expectations. He needed to be in line with God. Even at age 12, when his parents lost him, they found him in the temple. And if in Luke chapter 2, verse 49, Jesus said this once they found him. Did I say 49? It is 49. And he said to them, "Why were you looking for me? Did you not know that I must be in my Father's house?" And they did not understand the saying that he spoke to them. Right now, he wasn't in isolation, but he was with his Father in his house. Jesus says, hey, I need to be with my Father, and the response of the people is, I don't understand that. Why weren't you with us? Why weren't you meeting our expectations? Why are you trying to please God? And the reality is that oftentimes when we choose to spend alone time with God like Jesus did, others will have their own expectations of us as well. And they may not get what we're doing. Like, hey, I need time alone with God right now. Yeah, but I need you to go do this. And so for me, my first lesson was that if you're going to be alone with God, you can't bring the other stuff with you. I couldn't bring my responsibilities on a journey, which the purpose of it was to get away from my responsibilities, right? I had to escape that. And so once I accepted that, I finally felt freedom. I was able to sleep and relax and seek God without any distractions. And I was also able to absorb the beauty of our next stop in Glacier National Park. So I have some pictures here so you can see what Glacier looks like there. I mean, holy moly, what a place. It was just beautiful, just incredibly beautiful to be in Glacier. And in the title slide, you might have realized that it was me sitting in a kayak on a lake looking. That was the view I was looking at in the upper right-hand corner there. And I was experiencing Psalm 8, 3, and 4. It says, when I look at your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars which you have set in place, what is man that you are mindful of him, and the son of man that you care for him? You know, God's work always outshines what we do. In fact, everything we do is just some manipulation of his creation. We don't really create from nothing, right? Even when we build a house, we use his trees, and right? I mean, God is the one that actually gives us everything. And what's funny is when we live our lives, we often start to feel like we're important. Like, oh, my leadership is important, or my company makes so much money because of me, or my kids need me so badly. But the reality is we're not as important as we like to think. You know, while I was gone, Pastor Ben came up here and he gave us a very encouraging message about the Israelites taking the next step in following God. Jacob had a very enlightening series on the lives of worship that we are to live through the book of Leviticus. Adult and Teen Challenge came in and testified about how God is working in their lives. Last week, Uriah gave us a beautiful reminder of the love of the Father and the story of the prodigal son, or maybe the prodigal father, if you remember the lesson. You know, church, the food pantry still fed the community. The trustees still worked on the building. The youth and the children were still ministered to, right? Which is weird, because wasn't the all-important senior pastor gone? Why wasn't the building burned down? Or why wasn't there some altar to Zeus erected in the parking lot? Simple. I'm just not that important. I'm not as important as I would like to be or think I am sometimes. You know, Jesus' church, it's made up of all of us. We all have a role to play. It's not that we go so that the holy people we can watch them or something, right? And the reality is that even though we feel like we have to do these things, do you realize God has never once lost control of his creation, ever? He's in charge. He's always been in charge, and he's always going to be in charge. So when our problems get too big to handle, I hate to break it to you, but more you isn't the answer. Reconnecting with the one who is always in control is the answer. And so my second lesson that I learned in Glacier is this: you can find rest in the sovereignty of God. while I was sitting there in Glacier National Park staring at these massive mountains, right, something hit me. To God, this is nothing. We took this hike to Avalanche Lake, which was a 6-mile hike, and, to a human that feels long to walk for 6 miles, right? But in God's scale, it's laughably small. See, that's the picture of Avalanche Lake there, and I have to apologize that the pictures just don't do it justice. You'll have to go yourself. There's no other way. To be standing there at that lake, looking at these mountains and just like, wow, like, is this a real place? Am I actually here? Like, this is really in front of me right now. And I'm experiencing it through a screen, Like, it's like, man, it was just crazy to me. The mountains felt huge. I could turn in every direction, and there was no end to them. And yet, in the context of the universe that God created, these mountains are barely a speck. You realize the observable universe is 93 billion light years across? And God made all of that too. This is just a tiny little thing, and it left me in awe. It reminded me of how tiny my abilities are compared to His, and that is really comforting. And I realized this even more as we made our next stop, as I told you before, in Banff National Park in Alberta, Canada. So that's Banff. And that's how everybody looks in Banff. They gave me that on the way in, like, hey, you have to wear this. No. I actually spent a lot of the trip trying to find, like, the right cowboy hat. But, like, honestly, like, the best ones, like, looked like the, like, beach party bum type ones. And I was like, ah. Anyway. So Banff was as beautiful as Glacier, but it was different in a more, like, maple syrupy kind of way. It was like Glacier's majesty, like, hit you in the face, like you were there. But Banff, like, it showed you, like, the vastness of how far the Rockies actually stretch. I mean, so, like, look at this picture here. Or the next one, sorry, flip it over. There you go. That view right there, can you tell where I am? I'm in a well, I guess you can read. That's in a bathroom stall in Banff. That's the view out the window where men in Banff do the worst possible thing that humans do. That's what they can see out the window. I wasn't doing that at the time I took the picture, by the way. I feel like I should let you know. But that's the view. Like, it was amazing, right? So the way that I would describe the theme while we were in Banff was just this feeling of being overwhelmed. Like, you can imagine standing there and looking around, and it goes on forever, and just being overwhelmed by what God has done. But there was more about that part of the trip that made me feel overwhelmed. First of all, I have no idea what I paid for gas. They charge in Canadian cents per liter. I don't know any of those things. Is 130 Canadian cents per liter a good price? I don't know. Also, every time someone heard we were American, they brought up Trump. And I was like, I'm just here to see a moose, guys. I'm not like his secretary or something, right? But really what struck me most of all while I was there was there was a lacking you could feel in the spiritual climate. It was hard for me to find a church while we were there that seemed biblically solid. Because it's a touristy place, there were people there from all over the world, and many of them were clearly lost. Like, not lost like they couldn't find the direction, like lost as in they don't know Jesus. And I noticed that when I had conversations with people, I noticed that telling them I was a Christian wasn't usually very well received. Once I was having a nice conversation with the folks camping next to us, and after he asked me about Trump sanctions, he asked me what I did for a living. And I said, I'm a pastor. And he was like, oh, okay. Conversation over. Like, I don't even want to hear it. It was like I said, like, I do the bookkeeping for the Third Reich or something. Like, I was like, dude, I'm a pastor. Like, that really, like, shut you down? Well, here's the lesson that I learned from all those things. Lesson number 3. God reveals himself if you pay attention. God reveals himself if you pay attention. See, God's abilities while I was there were painfully evident to me. Like, you could see it everywhere. And yet there were so many people that just didn't seem to notice. They didn't seem to notice what God had done. And so it made me think of Romans chapter 1 while I was there. Now, in Romans chapter 1, Paul famously says, For what can be known about God is plain to them because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made, so they are without excuse. Basically, he's saying, look at the world around you. You can see that there is a God, right? And it's funny because even like I would hear like the tour guide talking about things who was not a Christian. He would say something like, oh, like these animals, they're designed to live in this climate. And I'm like, design? Like, doesn't design imply there's a designer? Like, how can you believe that they were designed to do something if you think it's all by accident, all random? Well, I think it's because deep down we can't help but see intentionality in creation. The things were done on purpose. And Paul was right. God's fingerprints are everywhere. But there are many people who would just rather not acknowledge him. And so people today respond just like the ones that Paul was talking about. In verse 22, it says, claiming to be wise, they became fools. Like, oh, I know so much. And it's like, well, actually. And it was sad to see that there were these people who were so empty as they stood in the midst of some of God's most beautiful handiwork. And now it wasn't like we were like walking through Sodom and Gomorrah or something like that. I'm not trying to like paint that kind of picture. But the spiritual lacking was there. And it continued on into our next stop, which we went further north into Jasper National Park. Now here, God switched up kind of what he was doing there with us. We had just dropped Gracie off to fly back home, so it was just me and Tosh, okay? And so here's the images here of Jasper, and I don't know how well you could see the burning there, but while Gracie, on the upper right-hand corner, you could see that there was a forest fire that burned a lot of the trees, so it wasn't quite the same. But on the next slide here, you can see while we were with Gracie, we did like all kind of stuff. Right? Kayaking, whitewater rafting, we rode the Sky Tram, we took a tour bus to 2 beautiful glacial lakes, and we rode this giant 6x6 bus thing and took us out onto a glacier where you could drink like the water from the glacier, but not too much or you would pay for that later. So we did all these things when Gracie was with us, and then when Gracie left, me and Tosh, like we played rummy. we did more than that. But the reality is that Tosh and I, we got to just spend time, just the two of us. It was just us. And Betty, of course. And, we were just hanging out and walking and playing games and praying and whatever, and just having conversations that we don't normally get to have because we don't have to sit there and be like, hey, did you pay the light bill or, whatever. Like, we just got to just connect, which was really, really nice. And we just honestly felt like God wanted to take that part of the trip and just slow us down. I mean, can you imagine that? Slowing down on a trip about resting? Seems weird, huh? We found time to rest while Gracie was with us, but Gracie, she doesn't really sit still too good. So, we had to do some stuff. And now Jasper was nice, but honestly, that wildfire from last year, it really dulled the beauty a little bit. So there was less temptation to just go fill the schedule. I mean, that fire burned 39,000 hectares, whatever that means. It actually means 96,000 acres. I had to Google that, though. There was just so much devastation. And fortunately, it stopped right at the edge of the Jasper Sky Tram. And so we got to ride the Jasper Sky Tram up to the top of the mountain to see the view of the town. That's where I got the pictures from there, and you can see the Sky Tram there. But once we got to the top of the mountain, we were going to have dinner or lunch or whatever it was, and I felt this sting on my neck, and I smashed this spider. And then as we walked to our table, another spider fell on my arm. And I killed that sucker too. And then as we sat down at the table, another one fell onto the table. I killed him, and I looked up and saw a fourth one scurrying across the ceiling, and I was like, I'm pretty sure the devil is in this place. That doesn't have anything to do with the lesson I learned there. I just wanted to share that story. But the actual lesson that I learned while we were in Jasper is actually very important. Here's the fourth fill in the blank. God makes it clear that rest is important. It is important. And it was nice to slow down, but it's also important to slow down. While I was on this trip, I thought a lot about Sabbath and rest and things like that. And, if you talk to, Christian Sabbatarians, many of them would say, I practice the Sabbath because in the 10 Commandments it tells me to do it. And I think that's an interesting reason to do it. First of all, and this might be controversial, I don't think the 10 Commandments directly apply to us. The Ten Commandments were given to Israel after they agreed to be God's chosen people at Mount Sinai, and they were fulfilled by Jesus along with the rest of the law, not abolished but fulfilled. Now, before you light your torches and grab your pitchforks to come after me, I need to clarify something. Because many people would say, wait, are you saying that it's okay to murder and steal and commit adultery and all that kind of stuff? Of course not. I'm not saying murder is okay. I'm just saying that the Ten Commandments isn't the only way that we would know that. Every single one of the Ten Commandments is affirmed elsewhere in Scripture that does apply to us. Okay, so that doesn't change, right? But I'm just saying that the commandment itself is not the reason why we know that. I would explain it this way. If you had a set of house rules that say no punching people in the face, which I think is a good house rule, then you go to the store and you punch someone in the face and get arrested for assault, how well is it going to work for you when you go to the judge and say, no, that's a house rule that says not to punch people in the face, and I wasn't at my house? What's the judge going to say? Great, you didn't break the house rules, but you broke the law in Illinois, so you're going to jail, right? Well, it's kind of the same thing. If you lie, you may not be going against the Ten Commandments, but you can be held accountable because of everything else that Scripture says about lying, like when Colossians tells us not to lie to each other, and Proverbs says lying is an abomination to God, and Revelation excludes liars from the kingdom of heaven, and God strikes down the people who lie to the church, right? I think it's pretty clear that lying is a sin for us, even if we don't know it because it's a commandment. But it gets a little bit trickier when we get to the Sabbath one. It's different. Now, many Christians think that the Sabbath comes from the Ten Commandments in Exodus chapter 20, but that is not true. That's not where the Sabbath comes from. The Sabbath is instituted in Exodus chapter 16, 4 chapters before, right? Which means that the Sabbath exists outside of the Ten Commandments, right? Here, the Israelites were in the wilderness, and they were whining because they were hungry. And so God miraculously provided manna and quail to eat, but there was something that went along with it. In Exodus chapter 16, verse 23, it says, He said to them, This is what the Lord has commanded. Tomorrow is a day of solemn rest, a holy Sabbath to the Lord. Bake what you will bake and boil what you will boil, and all that is left over lay aside to be kept till the morning. So essentially, the plan was God is going to send food with a little bit of extra over a 6-day period, and then the 7th day, you just eat the extra. Why? Because there's something more important you should be doing on the 7th day than just working, and that is worshiping the Lord through rest. And so today, we don't follow the law of the Sabbath the way the Israelites agreed to, but there is an important thing to grasp. Whether or not it is a rule, practicing Sabbath or getting rest is still a good idea, church. That hasn't changed. God didn't give the Sabbath so they just had a weird, unnecessary rule to follow. He gave the Sabbath because resting is a good idea, and that hasn't changed a bit. That's why Jesus spent so much time getting away and resting with his Father, giving us an example to follow, right? That's what he wants us to do. And so the importance of this rest takes us from Jasper over to the city of Edmonton, Alberta. So when we got to Edmonton, while we were here, we visited the West Edmonton Mall, which is the biggest mall in the Americas by number of stores. The Mall of America is bigger by square footage. So here's a picture of all the things you can do there. I took that Lego picture just for you, Jacob. So this mall is wildly enormous, okay? There's more than 800 stores. There's 100 restaurants, 2 hotels, a theme park, a water park, a casino, and a pirate ship with a sea lion show. And best of all, right smack in the middle of the mall is an NHL-sized hockey rink. Heaven, I'm in heaven. It was awesome. How great was it to see a hockey rink in the middle? So we left the natural beauty of the Canadian Rockies to indulge in a true shrine to the nature of consumerism. And in all honesty, we really actually enjoyed this part of the trip a lot. It had been quite a while since we went back to the days of our youth and walked through a mall that has people in it. I hope nobody in here owns a mall and I just hurt your feelings. And so while we were here in Edmonton, I received a slap in the face kind of lesson. Back at the campground laundromat, we met a guy named Merrick, who was a Romanian man going through a divorce, losing his job and struggling with alcoholism. And he poured out his story to us, but once he found out I was a pastor, he shifted into, let me tell you what's wrong with the church. And it was like, wow, so your life is this way, but you know how to fix the church. Okay, interesting. And even so, we were really glad to meet him. It was a really nice conversation. He's a really, really nice guy. And we asked if we could pray for him, and he agreed to that, and I was grateful for the conversation. So if you fast forward to the next afternoon at the mall, I was sitting outside of Tim Hortons, because in Canada you can't not be sitting outside of a Tim Hortons. And we were watching a girls' hockey team from Illinois compete at the hockey rink, which was really cool. That was the most Illinois pride I've ever had, since moving here. I was so pumped. Anyway. So I'm watching this game, and I look over at this lady, and I accidentally make eye contact with her. And I had no idea that I just made myself a target. She offered her table to me because they were leaving, and I went over there and started just what I thought was just a polite conversation as she grabbed her stuff. And then her friend came over and started talking with us. And we talked about the mall and how cool it was and how much money they must make there and yada, yada. And then the guy says, yeah, money can be good. You can buy a lot of good things with money. Like a Bible. And I was like, well, that was a weird way to bring up the subject of Jesus, but cool. All right, they must be evangelists, right? And so I thought, okay, I'll just let them know that I'm a Christian. We'll talk about what the Lord is doing in our lives. We'll encourage each other, and we'll move on. This is cool. So I mentioned I'm a pastor, and he starts quizzing me. I assume that because they're going through the mall and talking to people, they must get a lot of people who are like, oh yeah, I'm a pastor of the Universal Answers to the Stars Church or whatever. And so he wanted to make sure I was legit. So I told him who Jesus is, and so we're all good. And the lady starts telling me that they're there because they're evangelizing because there's a lot of work to do in Alberta. And I was like, you know what? I have noticed that spiritual gap since I've been here. I'm very grateful for what you guys are doing. I think it's cool. And she says, you could be doing this too. And my first thought was, hey, I'll tell them about my conversation with Merrick at the laundromat yesterday, right? So I started to say, well, I'm actually here on sabbatical, and we're staying at this campground outside of town. We met this guy named Merrick. But she stopped me. All I got out was, she said, oh, you should do evangelism. And I'm like, well, so I'm actually here on sabbatical. And so she goes, no excuses. She thought I was trying to wriggle out of evangelizing. I'm on sabbatical, right? And I was like, oh, no, really. My wife and I were witnessing to this guy last night. I swear, we're not lazy Christians. We love Jesus, I promise, right? Trying to defend myself. It was like I just got caught sleeping on the job or something. And so after I thought about this for 2 days, I wish I would have responded differently to that. Because it made me think about what Paul said when the Corinthians were arguing about whether Paul or Apollos was more important. Paul asked a question in 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 5, when they were trying to say, oh, I'm of Paul, I'm of Apollos, and trying to figure out who was more important of the two. And, it is this one. And so what he said, what then is Apollos? What is Paul? Servants through whom you believed as the Lord assigned to each. I planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the growth. So neither he who plants nor he who waters is anything, but only God who gives the growth. And when I think about that, I'm thinking, how could we ever convince ourselves that God couldn't save people without our work? Our evangelism is so important that I cannot rest or people will go to hell. Does God tell us that? No, the scripture here just says that Paul and Apollos aren't anything in what they're doing because it is God who delivers. Now, he does say that the labor that they do for the Lord is a good thing, and all of us should labor for the Lord. That's not what I'm saying here. But tell me this, who is a better worker? The one who keeps doing whatever they think is good for their boss, or the one who does what their boss tells them to do? Who's the better worker? If I said, hey, God, I'm running around and working on my sabbatical, doesn't that mean I'm a good servant? God would probably say, no, that doesn't make you my servant. That makes you disobedient. Because my example is for you to get away and get rest so you can do these kind of things well. If you take your rest time and turn it into work time, that's disobedience. Here was the fifth lesson that I learned. Resting is actively following Jesus' example. Jesus' example to us includes time to rest, even when the crowds are following him. He invited the weary to come to him for what? Rest. Jesus didn't burn out. You know why? Because he set a rhythm of renewal. So why do we think we're better off if we just ignore his example and do it our own way? It's not our work that gets things done, it's God's work that gets things done. And he tells us to rest so we can be effective later. When that lady told me no excuses, I should have said, "You're right. That's why I won't make any excuses in neglecting to rest." And so here we left Edmonton and we went over to Saskatchewan. There's nothing in Saskatchewan. I have no slides for that one. We stopped in Saskatoon, and then we got down to Regina, which is the capital, and something interesting happened there. We were at another laundromat, which apparently is where all the good stuff happens, and a woman came out of the laundromat as we were walking in, and she goes, "Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. I just took all 4 of the washing machines." And it was like, wow, you do a lot of laundry. You need to take up all 4 so none of us can do it. But really, we were like, it's no big deal. We have nowhere to be. We'll come back in 45 minutes and throw your clothes on the floor. It's fine. And so we turn around, we start walking back to the camper, and Tosh sees that we have a booking request for our rental. If you guys don't know this, we're basement dwellers, and we rent out the upper floors of our house. And so we had a booking request. And of course, we want to rent it out and make some money, but in all of our cleaners, they had to work. And so it was like, well, we can say no, or we can leave right now. And it was like, this sounds fun. Let's do it. So right then and there, we decided, okay, let's pack up. We packed up the camper, hooked up to the truck, drove 1,200 miles in 27 hours with a quick stop to sleep, which didn't go very well because a very loud thunderstorm rolled through. But we just kind of huffed it and came back, 1,200 miles straight through. And the final lesson I learned in that is this: remember to thank God for the little things. That's your last fill in the blank. Remember to thank God for the little things. Now, I didn't get to experience the wonders of Fargo, North Dakota on the way back. And it wasn't some crazy event that we came home early. But coming home early did give me 5 extra days before coming back to church so that I could rest at home. I got to play hockey against a couple of second graders who were way better than they should have been. Or maybe I'm the problem there. I got to read a little. I got to tinker on some projects. We brought in income that more than paid for the money that we lost. It felt like it was exactly what I needed as my final phase before coming back to church. And you know what? I was sure glad that God orchestrated things so that lady took all the washing machines that day, because we wouldn't have been able to leave and come home early if we did. Now that's a small detail, right? It's not a miracle, but I think God lined it up that way because he wanted us to go home. And I wonder how often we take time to thank God for small things like that. When we see the pattern of God in our lives, do we thank God for the Novocaine at the dentist, or the sound of the wind blowing through the cornfields, or that our children are sleeping safely in their beds? There were so many opportunities on this trip for me to worship God. As we walked through the trees, Tosh and I, we imagined that each tree represented the life of a Christian. And so we'd come up with stories for all the trees that we walked by. It was a nice time. It was like, oh, that tree's barren at the bottom, but it's really full at the top, so it got saved later in life. And, oh, that tree is really struggling, that's why it's falling over, but those other trees are holding it up right now, right? Like we'd create these stories as we were just walking together through the woods. It was just nice to be able to do that, which you can't always do when you're busy. As we drove through God's mountains, we expressed thanks for all the people in our church. I mean, many of you, we brought your names up. Like, it was nice because I was thinking about you as people, but I didn't have to think about the rules and the structure and the politics or anything like that. It was like, I just get to thank God for the people in our church. As we rafted down the river, we got to laugh at our hilarious tour guide with a funny mustache. It's a gift. There were so many beautiful moments and so many things that we had to be thankful for. And so it's important that we take time to recognize that, because it's encouraging. And it's easier to do when you're rested. So to summarize everything, my sabbatical, I would encourage you with this final thought. Living our lives for Christ is a race. But church, it's a long race. The types of races that we run are the types that we have to pace ourselves on, that we have to take pit stops on, that we have to rest between legs or we won't make it. It's an endurance race, not a sprint. And so as you work, I encourage you to take time to smell the roses and thank God for them.